it's your nerdy suburban farmer. Today it's an update with the worms. I'm starting in the bins that are my regular tote. They don't have any holes at the bottom. They just have a hole in the lid. But currently with my totes, since I was having an issue with them being very wet, I don't keep the lid on them. I just have a screen or cheesecloth covering it. And when I opened up this bin this week, the area where I had the bubble wrap was a lot more moist than the area that was uncovered. So these bins are drying out, which I am happy about. I really don't like overly wet bins. And the same goes for the second, although the difference in texture is not visible as well on camera. The area with the bubble tape had a much more clumpier feel than this area that was uncovered. Now both areas are still pretty clumpy and have a consistency that's more cakey than I want it to be. As you can see here, it doesn't wipe away as fast. But again, the worms are loving it. There's a large clump of worms here. They're happy, they're moving around, they're breaking down the food. So overall, the bins are doing very well. Instead of spreading the paper all throughout the bin this time, so that the castings don't hold too much moisture, I'm going to put paper underneath of the food that I put into the bin for this week. And again this week, I'm going to leave the bubble wrap in the area where I fed instead of spreading it all over. I do want both of these regular totes to continue to dry out a bit more before I cover them completely with their lids. Moving over to the Vermibag totes, which have just been restarted. They've had 2 weeks of the harvested worms put into this bin with no additional food. The previous week, the bins were a little on the dry side, but after 2 weeks of adding the worms and whatever food was in the bait trays, the bins are starting to regulate. Now last week, on top of the bait trays, I put cardboard as a way to mark where the bait tray began and the castings ended to avoid taking too many of the finished castings. Looking at the harvest tray now, I don't see a lot of worms hanging out. The castings feel really good. They're clumping the way that they should and breaking apart, so they've got a good moisture content without being overly wet. So based on the lack of worms in the finished castings, this tray is ready to go for sifting. And once I turned out the bait tray, it did further support moving the harvest castings into the sifting phase, as it was a lot of food left over and not many worms left in the container. So since this was the last week that I would be using the bait tray, I removed all of the food and then left the bait tray inside of the Vermibag tote. That way any worms that were still hanging on the outside that I couldn't see, they would get a chance to move into the bin itself and out of the bait tray. Moving over to the sister Vermi bag tote, which is going through its harvest. This bin was more damp than the sister bin, but wasn't overly damp. So it's in that range that I prefer. Around the edges where the bubble tape wasn't covering, it was a bit drier, and towards the bottom. So I do fluff the bags just to make sure that everything is mixed together. But there were worms in here that were looking happy, and there wasn't any food, so I am going to additionally feed this one. And again, just feeling for the bait tray and feeling the castings in the bait tray, which have dried significantly from when they were first put into the harvest bin 3 weeks ago. The castings in this bin as well showed no signs of large worms or large numbers of worms, so this is also ready to go through the harvest phase. When I turned out the bait tray, same thing as with the previous tray, there was a lot of remaining food and just a few worms on the outside, so it supports that most of the worms have been turned out. So I am going to just begin feeding this bag only and not putting another bait tray or doing another week of trying to bait out the worms. When it comes to sifting, if there are any worms, they'll end up being sifted out of the bait tray. So I'm just putting the food into a corner pocket and giving it the grit and covering it up, and now just beginning a new cycle with the 2 Vermi bag totes. Lastly, the update on the worms in the Vermi bag mini shows that they're doing really well. The material in the bag is still more damp than I like it, and I noticed that there were some beetles and potworms in the bag itself. So for this bag, I am going to give an additional bit of grit, as the grit that I use does contain neem cake, and the neem cake helps to cut down on the beetles that do sometimes come up. So I'm putting some of that underneath of the food, and I'm also going to do an additional amount after I've put the food in. And I'm also going to add more cardboard and paper to the bin to try to dry it out a bit again. Now next week, if the bag is still on the wetter side, I will take the bubble wrap and fold it up. But that concludes this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed.